Picture this: August 2nd, 216 BCE. The sun is rising over the Apulian plain in southeastern Italy, and you're about to witness the single bloodiest day in Roman history. Before the sun sets, more than 50,000 men will be dead. An entire generation of Roman leadership will be wiped out. 80 Roman senators, 80, will lie dead on this field. And all of this will happen because of one man's tactical genius and one of the most devastating military maneuvers ever conceived: the double envelopment. This is the Battle of Cannae. And if you think you know this story, think again. Because what happened here wasn't just a battle. It was a masterclass in military tactics so brilliant that armies are still studying it over 2,000 years later. The U.S. Army teaches it at West Point. Modern generals reference it in their planning. And when you understand exactly how Hannibal pulled this off, you'll see why. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take you through this battle step by step, moment by moment, so you can see exactly how one of history's greatest tactical minds turned a smaller, weaker army into an unstoppable killing machine. And by the end, you're going to understand why this battle changed warfare forever. Let's start with the context, because Cannae didn't happen in a vacuum. By 216 BCE, Rome and Carthage had been locked in a brutal conflict for over 2 years. This was the Second Punic War, and it had started when a Carthaginian general named Hannibal did the impossible. He marched an army from Spain through southern Gaul and over the Alps into Italy, with elephants, in winter. Now, Hannibal wasn't just any general. He was 29 years old when he took command of the Carthaginian army in Spain, and he had literally been raised for war. His father, Hannibal Barca, had fought Rome in the First Punic War and had made young Hannibal swear an oath of eternal hatred against Rome. This wasn't just a military campaign for Hannibal. It was personal. When Hannibal crossed into Italy in 218 BCE, Rome didn't take him seriously at first. Big mistake. He destroyed a Roman army at the Trebia River. Then he ambushed and annihilated another at Lake Trasimene, killing 15,000 Romans in 3 hours. Rome was in panic mode. The Senate was desperate, and they made a decision that would lead directly to the catastrophe at Cannae. They decided to raise the largest army Rome had ever fielded and crush Hannibal once and for all. Think about Rome's position here. They were the rising superpower of the Mediterranean. They had the manpower, the resources, and the training. Their legions were legendary for their discipline and organization. They had conquered most of Italy through sheer military excellence. And now this Carthaginian upstart was running around their homeland, burning their farms and making them look weak. Rome wasn't going to tolerate that, so they doubled their usual consular armies. Instead of the normal 4 legions, they raised 8. They called up their allies across Italy. When the army finally assembled, it numbered somewhere between 80,000 and 86,000 men. The largest army Rome had ever put in the field. Leading this massive force were 2 consuls, as was Roman tradition: Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Paulus was an experienced, cautious commander from the aristocratic class. Varro was a populist, aggressive, and eager to prove himself. They were supposed to share command, alternating daily. This was already a recipe for disaster, but we'll get to that. Hannibal, meanwhile, had about 50,000 men. He was outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. His army was a mixed bag: Spanish infantry, Gallic warriors who joined him as he marched through their territory, African veterans, and Numidian cavalry from North Africa. They'd been living off the Italian countryside for 2 years, and they were tired, hungry, and a long way from home. On paper, this should have been a Roman victory. They had superior numbers, better equipment, and they were fighting on their own soil with secure supply lines. Hannibal was cornered in southern Italy with his back against the wall. But Hannibal had something Rome didn't. A plan so audacious, so perfectly executed, that it would become the gold standard for tactical brilliance for the next 2 millennia. Let's talk about the terrain because it matters. Cannae was a small town in Apulia, in the heel of Italy's boot. The Romans had been shadowing Hannibal's movements, and when he captured the Roman supply depot at Cannae, they had to respond. The battle took place on a flat plain near the Aufidus River, modern-day Ofanto. This was crucial. The flat terrain favored the Romans, or so they thought, because it gave them room to deploy their massive army in their preferred formation. The Roman battle formation was called the triplex acies, 3 lines of infantry. The front line was the hastati, young soldiers who would engage first. Behind them were the principes, experienced men in their prime. And in the rear were the triarii, veterans who served as the last line of defense. The saying went, "It's come to the triarii when things were desperate." For Cannae, the Romans did something unusual. They deepened their formation. Normally, Roman maniples, or units of about 120 men, were deployed with space between them for flexibility. But at Cannae, either Varro or both consuls decided to pack the legions tighter and deeper. They created a massive column designed to punch through Hannibal's center with brute force. This was pure Roman military thinking, mass, discipline, and relentless forward pressure. They placed their Roman cavalry on the right wing, near the river. Their allied Italian cavalry went on the left wing. The massive infantry block sat in the center. It was an intimidating sight. Somewhere around 80,000 men in tight formation, shields locked, ready to steamroll anything in their path. Now let's look at what Hannibal did. And this is where it gets interesting. Hannibal deployed his army in a very peculiar formation. He placed his Gallic and Spanish infantry in the center, but instead of forming a straight line, he arranged them in a crescent shape that bulged out toward the Romans. Imagine a bow that's been bent backward. This was the bait. Behind this crescent, he placed his African infantry, his best, most experienced troops, in 2 blocks on either side of the Gauls and Spanish. These African veterans were equipped with Roman armor and weapons they'd captured in previous battles. They were positioned at an angle slightly back from the center. On the wings, he placed his cavalry. On his left wing, near the river, he put his heavy cavalry, Spanish and Gallic horsemen under the command of Hasdrubal, Hannibal's most trusted cavalry commander. On his right wing, he placed his Numidian light cavalry, expert horsemen from North Africa who were masters of the feint and skirmish. Here's what Hannibal was counting on. He knew the Romans would smash into his center. He knew his Gallic and Spanish troops couldn't hold against that kind of pressure. And he was okay with that. In fact, he was counting on it. The crescent formation was designed to do 2 things. First, it would slow the Roman advance because the Romans would hit the center first and the wings later, creating uneven pressure. Second, as the crescent got pushed back, it would naturally form a pocket, drawing the Romans deeper into Hannibal's trap. Meanwhile, his cavalry would win the battles on the flanks, then swing around behind the Romans. And those African infantry blocks, they would will inward as the Romans pushed forward, attacking the Roman flanks. This was the double envelopment. Attack from the front, the sides, and eventually the rear, surrounding the enemy completely. Create a pocket with no escape, and then slaughter them. It sounds simple when you lay it out like this, but executing it on a chaotic battlefield with 130,000 men fighting and dying? That requires genius-level coordination and an almost supernatural ability to predict exactly how your enemy will react. Let's watch it unfold. The battle began with the cavalry action on both flanks. This is crucial because cavalry would determine the outcome of the entire battle. On Hannibal's left, near the river, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry clashed with the Roman cavalry. The Roman horsemen were good, well-equipped, and brave, but they were vastly outnumbered and caught in a confined space between the river and the infantry lines. Hasdrubal's cavalry crashed into them with devastating force. The fighting here was brutal and close quarters. Ancient sources describe it as more like infantry combat on horseback, with men literally pulling each other off their mounts. The Romans fought hard, but they were overwhelmed. Within probably less than an hour, maybe even just minutes, the Roman cavalry broke and fled. Some historians believe the Roman cavalry commander, Paulus himself, was wounded here early in the battle, which would explain the poor Roman command decisions that followed. Hasdrubal, showing the kind of tactical awareness that separates good commanders from great ones, didn't chase the fleeing Romans. That's what most commanders would do, pursue the broken enemy and rack up easy kills. But Hasdrubal had a job to do. He wheeled his cavalry around behind the entire battle line and rode across the rear of both armies to reach the opposite flank. Think about that for a second. In the middle of the chaos and noise and dust of a massive battle, Hasdrubal kept his cavalry under control, redirected them across the battlefield, and prepared to deliver a second devastating blow. Meanwhile, on the other flank, the Numidian cavalry was engaged with the Roman allied cavalry. The Numidians were different from Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry. They were light horsemen, masters of harassment tactics. They would ride in, throw javelins, and dart away. They weren't trying to crush the Roman allies. They were trying to tie them down and keep them occupied. And it worked. The Roman allied cavalry couldn't break away to help the infantry. They were stuck in an indecisive but constant skirmish with the Numidians. Now, while the cavalry battle was being decided, the main event was happening in the center. The Roman infantry began their advance. Imagine being in those front ranks. You're a hastatus, maybe 19 or 20 years old. You've been trained in the Roman way. Hold your position, trust your shield, trust the man next to you, and push forward. You're shoulder to shoulder with tens of thousands of your countrymen. You can feel the ground shake as 80,000 men march in unison. You hit Hannibal's center line like a tidal wave. The Gallic and Spanish warriors in Hannibal's crescent formation fought hard. These weren't poorly trained barbarians. The Spanish infantry were fierce warriors with excellent swords and shields. The Gauls were tall, strong fighters known for their ferocity. But they were facing the full weight of 8 Roman legions packed into a tight formation. The crescent began to bend backward, exactly as Hannibal planned. As the Romans pushed forward, the crescent inverted. Instead of bulging out toward the Romans, it now curved inward, forming a pocket. The Romans, sensing victory, pushed harder. They were doing what they'd been trained to do. Maintain formation, press forward, grind down the enemy. But here's what they didn't see happening on their flanks. As the Roman center pushed forward into the pocket, they were creating a U-shape in the battle line. The Roman legions in the center were ahead of the rest of the army, and those African infantry blocks that Hannibal had positioned on either side of his center, they were now level with the Roman flanks. On command, the African veterans wheeled inward 90 degrees and slammed into the exposed sides of the Roman legions. Imagine you're a Roman soldier in the middle of the formation. You've been pushing forward for maybe an hour. You're exhausted. Your arm is tired from holding your shield. You've been stepping over bodies of Gauls and Spanish and your own comrades. You can taste victory. And suddenly, out of nowhere, fresh enemy troops are attacking you from the side. You can't turn to face them because you're packed so tightly with your fellow soldiers. Your shield is facing forward. Your whole formation is designed to push ahead, not defend the flanks. Panic starts to spread. The Roman commanders try to respond, but they're in the middle of the mass, and communication in ancient battles was nearly impossible once fighting started. The Romans try to extend their flanks to meet this new threat, but they're too tightly packed. The men in the rear don't know what's happening up front. And then it gets worse. Remember Hasdrubal's cavalry? They've now reached the opposite flank, and they crash into the Roman allied cavalry from behind. The allied cavalry, already locked in combat with the Numidians and now attacked from the rear, completely disintegrates. They break and run. Now Hasdrubal's cavalry and the Numidian cavalry have both flanks clear. And they do what cavalry does best when the enemy has no cavalry to stop them. They attack the infantry from behind. The double envelopment is complete. The Roman army is now completely surrounded. Front, sides, and rear, every direction has enemy forces pressing in. The Romans are trapped in a shrinking pocket with nowhere to go. This is where the true horror of Cannae begins. The Romans, packed so tightly they can barely move, become a target-rich environment. The Carthaginian forces press inward from all sides. The Roman soldiers in the outer ranks are cut down quickly. As men fall, the pocket gets smaller. The Romans try to maintain formation, but it's useless. They can't maneuver. They can't retreat. They can barely fight back. The afternoon sun beats down on the Italian plain. The dust is choking. The screaming is constant. Men are trampled by their own comrades. The wounded can't fall down because the press of bodies is so tight they die standing up, held in place by the crush of men around them. Some Romans try to break out. Small groups make desperate charges, trying to cut their way through the encirclement. A few succeed. Most don't. Consul Paulus, wounded early in the battle, fights in the ranks alongside his men. Ancient sources say he refused to flee and died fighting. Varro, the other consul, manages to escape with about 70 cavalry. The slaughter continues for hours. The Carthaginians are methodical, professional, relentless. They've trained for this. They know how to maintain the encirclement while systematically killing the trapped Romans. As evening approaches, the battlefield is carpeted with bodies. Roman bodies. The estimates vary, but ancient sources suggest between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans were killed at Cannae in one afternoon, on one field. To put that in perspective, that's more Americans than died in the entire Vietnam War. In one day, the Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War, lasted 3 days and killed about 7,000 men. Cannae killed 7 times that many in a few hours. Among the dead were 80 men of senatorial rank, basically Roman senators and former magistrates. An entire generation of Roman leadership was wiped out. Additionally, numerous military tribunes, cavalry commanders, and experienced centurions were killed. The cream of Roman society lay dead on the field. Carthaginian losses? Probably around 6,000 to 8,000 men, mostly from the Gallic and Spanish troops who bore the brunt of the Roman initial assault. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. When news of Cannae reached Rome, the city prepared for siege. They expected Hannibal to march on Rome itself and finish the war. Women wailed in the streets. The Senate met in emergency session. According to later Roman sources, there was such a shortage of manpower that they considered arming slaves and even, in one desperate proposal, prisoners. But Hannibal didn't march on Rome. This is one of history's great debates. Why didn't he follow up his victory? Some say he lacked siege equipment. Others say his Carthaginian government didn't send reinforcements. His cavalry commander Hannibal supposedly said, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you don't know how to use one." Whatever the reason, Hannibal's decision not to march on Rome gave the Romans time to recover. And recover they did. Here's where the story gets interesting from a different angle. Because most armies, after suffering a defeat like Cannae, would have surrendered, would have sued for peace, would have given Hannibal whatever he wanted. Rome didn't. The Roman response to Cannae tells you everything you need to know about why Rome became an empire. The Senate refused to even discuss peace. They declared a state of emergency. They raised new legions from barely military-age boys and old veterans. They armed slaves and promised them freedom if they fought. They scraped together every resource they had. But more importantly, they learned. Rome realized they couldn't beat Hannibal in a direct confrontation. So they didn't try. They appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, and he implemented what became known as Fabian strategy. Avoid battle, shadow Hannibal's movements, cut his supply lines, wage a war of attrition. It was humiliating. Romans mocked Fabius as the delayer, but it worked. Hannibal spent 13 more years in Italy, winning battles but unable to win the war. Rome slowly bled him dry while building new armies and opening new fronts in Spain and Africa. Eventually, Rome invaded Africa and threatened Carthage itself. Hannibal was called home to defend his city. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, a Roman general named Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal using tactics Hannibal himself had pioneered, including a modified envelopment. Rome won the Second Punic War. Carthage was broken. Hannibal fled into exile and eventually committed suicide rather than be captured by Rome. And Rome emerged from the war as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. But they never forgot Cannae. The double envelopment became the dream of every Roman general who came after. Julius Caesar attempted variations of it. So did countless others. The tactical manual written by the Roman military theorist Vegetius centuries later still referenced Cannae as the example of what could happen if you weren't careful. But it wasn't just Romans who studied Cannae. The double envelopment became the gold standard of tactical warfare across cultures and eras. The Mongols under Genghis Khan used envelopment tactics to devastating effect across Asia. At the Battle of Mohi in 1241, they surrounded and destroyed a Hungarian army using tactics remarkably similar to Cannae. During World War II, German generals explicitly referenced Cannae when planning operations. The Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, where German forces encircled and destroyed two Russian armies, was called a modern Cannae. The German invasion of France in 1940, with its flanking maneuver through the Ardennes, was designed to create an envelopment of Allied forces. The failed German offensive at Stalingrad was an attempt at a massive envelopment that backfired spectacularly when the Soviets counter-encircled the German Sixth Army. The irony wasn't lost on military historians. The students of Cannae became victims of their own favorite tactic. In the Gulf War, General Norman Schwarzkopf's famous left hook maneuver, which sent armored divisions sweeping around Iraqi positions in Kuwait, was a modern mechanized version of envelopment. Schwarzkopf himself explicitly compared it to Cannae in post-war interviews. Why does Cannae remain so influential? Why are military academies still teaching it 2,200 years later? Because it represents the perfect battle. It's the Platonic ideal of tactical warfare. Use maneuver to negate the enemy's numerical advantage, draw them into a position where they can't use their strength, and then systematically destroy them. It's economy of force, deception, timing, and execution all working together perfectly. Modern military doctrine talks about combined arms warfare, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air power to create overwhelming advantage at decisive points. Hannibal was doing combined arms warfare in 216 BCE with infantry and cavalry. He understood that different force types have different capabilities and that using them together creates synergies greater than the sum of their parts. The Cannae model also teaches the importance of knowing your enemy. Hannibal knew the Romans would attack aggressively. He knew they relied on mass and discipline. He knew their cavalry was their weak point. He designed his entire battle plan around exploiting Roman strengths and weaknesses. That kind of intelligence-driven planning is the foundation of modern military strategy. But here's the thing about Cannae that often gets overlooked. It's almost impossible to replicate. Think about what had to go right for Hannibal. His cavalry had to decisively win both flank battles. His center had to retreat at exactly the right pace, too fast, and the Romans wouldn't pursue, too slow, and the center would collapse completely. His African infantry had to wheel inward at exactly the right moment. His cavalry had to resist the temptation to chase fleeing enemies and instead redeploy across the battlefield. Every single element had to work perfectly, and it did. Once. That's the genius of it, but also the impossibility of it. Countless generals have tried to recreate Cannae. Most failed. Because Cannae required not just a brilliant plan, but near-perfect execution against an enemy who cooperated by doing exactly what you expected them to do. That's a lesson too. In warfare, as in life, brilliant plans are worthless if you can't execute them. And execution requires training, discipline, leadership, and a healthy dose of luck. So what can we take away from Cannae today? Why should you care about a battle fought over 2 millennia ago? First, there's the obvious military history angle. If you're interested in how warfare works, Cannae is the masterclass. It shows the importance of terrain, timing, combined arms, morale, leadership, and adaptability. But there are broader lessons too. Cannae teaches us about the danger of overconfidence. Rome was so sure of victory that they ignored warning signs and walked into a trap. In business, in politics, in personal life, overconfidence kills. The Romans had superior numbers and resources, but they underestimated their opponent and overestimated their own invincibility. Teaches us about the value of innovation. Hannibal was outnumbered and operating in enemy territory. He couldn't win through conventional means, so he innovated. He created a battle plan that had never been attempted at that scale before. Innovation requires risk, but it's often the only way to overcome superior opposition. Teaches us about resilience. Rome lost 50,000 men at Cannae and didn't quit. They adapted, learned, and eventually won the war. The battle doesn't determine the war. Short-term defeats don't equal long-term failure. And perhaps most importantly, Cannae teaches us that systems matter more than individuals. Hannibal was a genius, probably the greatest tactical mind of the ancient world. But he lost the war because Rome's system, their ability to raise new armies, their network of allies, their political resilience, was stronger than any one man's brilliance. Think about that. The greatest tactical victory in history led to strategic defeat because tactics aren't enough. You need strategy. You need logistics. You need political will. You need systems that can absorb failure and keep going. Rome built those systems. Carthage didn't. That's why Rome became an empire that lasted centuries, and Carthage became a footnote. As you stand here on the fields of Cannae, 2,000 years after the bloodiest day in Roman history, the ground is peaceful now. Crops grow where legions died. The Aufidus River flows quietly past, its waters long since washed away the blood of 50,000 men. But the lessons of Cannae echo through time. They shaped how generals fight wars, how nations build armies, how strategists think about conflict. The double envelopment, that elegant, terrible maneuver that turned a smaller army into a killing machine, remains the dream scenario for military planners everywhere. Hannibal proved that superior tactics can overcome superior numbers. Rome proved that superior systems can overcome superior tactics. And together, they created a story that has captivated military minds for over 2 millennia. So the next time someone tells you that numerical advantage is everything, that bigger is always better, that conventional wisdom is always right, remember Cannae. Remember that sometimes the smaller force wins. Sometimes innovation defeats tradition. Sometimes the trap is so perfectly set that even knowing it's a trap doesn't help. And remember that one August day in 216 BCE, when a Carthaginian general from North Africa taught Rome the hardest lesson it ever learned, and created a legacy that would outlast both their civilizations. That's the Battle of Cannae. That's the double envelopment. That's military genius carved in blood and iron into the annals of history. What do you think? Could Hannibal's tactics work on a modern battlefield? Could you design a strategy today that would pull off a successful double envelopment against a modern army? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into history's greatest battles, hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, we're just getting started.